Right, we come to the first of the two statements. I call the Defence Secretary to make the statements. Grant Shapps.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on the recent response to Houthi aggression in the Red Sea. Freedom of navigation has been a cornerstone of civilization since time immemorial. It underpins our prosperity and our security. And it is a founding principle of the international rules-based system. Since October the 19th, the Houthis, supplied and aided by Iran, have been infringing on those fundamental freedoms by attacking international commercial vessels in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. On November the 19th, they illegally seized the merchant vessel Galaxy Leader using a helicopter-borne assault crew, and since then they've conducted around 40 attacks against commercial and military vessels. Despite repeated warnings, their attacks have continued. Mr. Speaker, the UK has always stood up for the rules-based international order. And since the Houthis began their illegal attacks, we've been at the forefront of the international response. Whether helping defend vessels in the vicinity, as one of the first members to join the US-led task force Operation Prosperity Guardian, or whether working in tandem with the US and other allies to tackle the Houthis, always in response to specific threats, and always in line with international law and the principle of self-defence. On two previous occasions, we've been required to use force, and these attacks have had a significant effect on degrading Houthi capabilities. But the Houthis' intent to continue disrupting the Red Sea has not been fully diminished. 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister came to the House to make it clear, as I did the following day, that unless Houthis desisted from their inflammatory actions, we would not hesitate to act again. Yet, instead of ceasing their activities, they have chosen to persist, accompanying their increasingly incendiary rhetoric with further missiles and drones targeted at shipping and at the Royal Navy. Most recently, they set the vessel Marlin Luanda on fire and targeted HMS Diamond directly in the Red Sea. Mr. Speaker, such behaviour is simply intolerable. It breaks international law, it's already having consequences which are damaging to the economies of the world, and insurance premiums have rocketed tenfold since the start of December. The number of cargo ships transiting Bab al-Mandab has fallen, and the cost of containers has rocketed, all of which could send food inflation spiralling and will certainly hit those countries with the greatest poverty levels the hardest. Mr. Speaker, the Houthis believe they are the region's Robin Hood. But as I discussed with the Yemeni Defence Minister just yesterday when I saw him in Saudi, the only people they are robbing are innocent Yemenis, whose food and aid arrives via the Red Sea. And that is why, at the weekend, the Prime Minister and I again authorised the use of force in strict accordance with international law and in self-defence. On Saturday, Royal Air Force Typhoon, supported by 2 Voyager tankers, joined the US forces to conduct further precision strikes against Houthi locations in Yemen. The Typhoons employed Paveway 4 precision-guided munitions against 3 military facilities, hitting 11 separate targets which were identified after a very careful analysis at those 3 locations, and they were approved by me. At As-Salif, due west of Sana'a on the Red Sea coast, our aircraft targeted a ground control station inside a defensive position. The station has been used to control Houthi attacks and reconnaissance drones launched from further inland and operating over the Red Sea and hitting international shipping, or targeted at. A second drone ground control station was confirmed to be Al-Manura on the same stretch of the coastline. As with Al-Salif, the station provided direct control of reconnaissance and attack drones targeting shipping in the Red Sea. Its position on the coast, allowing it to maintain line-of-sight data links used to target innocent shipping with accuracy. Our Typhoons also attacked a significant number of targets at Bani. The House may recall that an initial group of facilities at Bani were successfully struck by the RAF on the night of January the 11th this year. Since then, a further set of buildings at the site were positively confirmed as involved in the Houthi operations and were, as a result, targeted on this occasion. As is standard practice for operations by the RAF, the strikes were very carefully planned to ensure minimal risk of civilian casualties. Dropping munitions at night further reduces such risks. And we do not believe that there were any civilian casualties on Saturday night. Mr. Speaker, military action can only be one element in our efforts to confront these global challenges, and military action is indeed the very last resort. It would be far better if the Houthis simply stopped their attacks. So our approach is founded on 4 pillars. Firstly, we're increasing diplomatic engagement. The Foreign Secretary travelled to the region and met his Iranian counterpart last month to make clear they must cease supplying the Houthis with the weapons and the intelligence and use their influence to stop these Houthi attacks. The Prime Minister spoke to President Biden recently to discuss our joint approach. And I met with my counterparts in the region this weekend, returning this morning from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where I discussed regional security. Second, we must end the illegal flow of arms to the Houthis. Britain and the US have previously intercepted weapons shipments in the region, including the same kind of components that we've seen used in recent strikes. Third, we must cut off the Houthis' financial resources. We have already, last month, sanctioned 4 key figures within the Houthi regime. They include the commander of the Houthi naval forces and the Houthi defence minister. Fourthly, we continue to help the people of Yemen, delivering humanitarian aid and supporting a negotiated peace. The UK has committed £88 million in humanitarian support so far this year and feeding 100,000 Yemenis every month, with aid arriving through the very sea routes that the Houthis are actually, ironically, targeting. Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. We would much rather the Houthis simply stopped attacking international shipping, stopped damaging global trade, and stopped harming the prospects of their own people. At the same time, appeasing the Houthis today will not lead to a more stable Red Sea, indeed, a more stable region. And we're not seeking confrontation, and we urge the Houthis and all those who enable them to stop these illegal and unacceptable attacks. But if necessary, the UK will not hesitate to respond again in self-defence. Mr. Speaker, placating the sponsors of terror does not benefit our international order in the long run, or bring peace to the Middle East or elsewhere in Europe or indeed the world. The truth is, we cannot ignore the importance of these great waterways for shipping. And this is the reason why the world backs the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's the reason why New Zealand has joined the UK, US, Australia, Canada, Bahrain, Denmark and the Netherlands in providing support to this weekend's airstrike. It's the reason why, as an island nation, we have always appreciated the freedom of navigation and that it is intrinsic to our way of life. If we do not deal with these threats, then every nation will be poorer. And I commend this statement to that.
Senate Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Defence Secretary for the advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, we back the UK-US airstrikes at the weekend to protect shipping in the Red Sea. We know the strikes were carried out against Houthi command centres and weapon stores. We accept they were limited, necessary and targeted to minimise the risk of civilian casualties. Mr. Speaker, the Houthis are attacking the ships of many nations, threatening maritime security and international trade, putting civilian and military lives in serious danger. This is why the UN Security Council last month passed a resolution condemning Houthi actions in the strongest possible terms and demanding their attacks stop. We accept these strikes were justified, but I ask the Defence Secretary to confirm that they were also effective. Were the targets selected, the targets hit? Was the purpose to destroy the drone control centres at As-Salif and Al-Manura fully achieved? Ministers have said the aim of these strikes is first to deter Houthi attacks and second to degrade their capabilities. Well, the first aim has not yet succeeded as Houthi attacks continue, but is the fact that these Houthi attacks are now less sophisticated and more sporadic a sign that the second aim may be succeeding? Mr. Speaker, this is the third UK-US strike in the last 3 weeks. At what stage do 3 one-off strikes become a sustained campaign? And if this does develop into continuing military action, at what stage will the government give Parliament a say? Mr. Speaker, before I turn to UK forces' wider role in the Red Sea, may I make this point? It is the Prime Minister that should be making this statement to the House, just as he did after the 2 previous UK strikes on Houthi targets. It is the Prime Minister's responsibility to authorise such UK military action in the name of the Cabinet, advised, of course, by others, including and especially by the Defence Secretary. So I just say this: the government risks downgrading respect for the Convention, that having given the go-ahead for such action, it is the Prime Minister that then reports directly to this House. Mr. Speaker, we also back the leading role that the Royal Navy has in the continuing defence of shipping from all nations in the Red Sea. What action is the government taking to persuade other countries to join the Prosperity Guardian Protection Force? How long does the Defence Secretary expect Operation Prosperity Guardian to be needed? And how will the EU's new maritime mission to the Red Sea coordinate operations with Prosperity Guardian? 2 weeks ago, I asked the Defence Secretary if the UK carrier was ready to deploy to the Red Sea. Well, now we know the HMS Queen Elizabeth has serious problems. So does the UK still have an option of sending a UK carrier to the Red Sea if required? And if so, when? Mr. Speaker, military action on its own cannot solve the problems in this region. So what is the government's diplomatic action to pressure the Houthis to cease their attacks and settle the civil war in Yemen, and to pressure Iran to stop supplying weapons and intelligence to the Houthis? Finally, like the Defence Secretary, I totally reject the Houthi claims that firing missiles and drones at ships from around the world is somehow linked to the conflict in Gaza. They've been attacking oil tankers and seizing ships for at least 5 years, not just the 121 days since October the 7th. These attacks do absolutely nothing for the Palestinian people, and their agonies are now extreme. We want the Gaza fighting to stop with a humanitarian truce now that can build into a sustainable ceasefire, to stop the killing of innocent civilians, get all the remaining hostages out, get much more aid into Gaza. And the UK aid efforts must be accelerated. Have any more RAF flights taken off since the Defence Secretary was last in this chamber? And if not, why not? Finally, for long-term peace, there has to be a political process that can turn the rhetoric around 2 states living side by side in peace into reality. The House is united in this UK vision, and I give this commitment from our side that if elected to form the next government, Labour will lead this new push for peace.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I start by welcoming the Honourable Gentleman's, Right Honourable Gentleman's support for this action. He asked a series of questions. I'm going to rattle through them. Were they effective? Yes, they hit the targets. Were all the targets hit? Yes, again. We are still carrying out the surveillance to find out exactly what the impact will have been, but I think we can be very confident that all of the relevant objectives were reached. We combine very closely with our US colleagues and sometimes interchange some of those targets with them. Overall, he will have noted that on this occasion we were involved in munitions on more targets than previously, so that we carried a slightly greater weight than previously. He talks about whether the action is successful and rightly points out that what we're seeing is rather more sporadic. The attacks on HMS Diamond and on merchant shipping have indeed continued, but in a much more ad hoc fashion, and it is perhaps the case or relevant that there hasn't been an attack which has used multiple different weapons at the same time, as I think we saw, for example, on the 11th of January. The degrading will have had some impact on that. I'll come back to his comments at the end about the Prime Minister, and I just want to sort of set the record straight for him on that. He asked the question on Operation Prosperity Guardian. The simple answer, of course, is none of us know how long this will need to continue, but we do want to see this come to a conclusion as quickly as possible. We utterly reject any notion that this attack, these continued attacks by the Houthis, are in fact anything to do with the situation in Gaza. The Houthis are opportunist pirates who are using a situation to their benefit. A few years ago, they didn't even support Hamas. Suddenly, they want to be their greatest champions. They are over 2,000 kilometres away. They are simply using the situation to their advantage, and I think it is wise for the House not to overlink the two. He is nonetheless absolutely right about the need to see the humanitarian truce and then a sustainable ceasefire. Indeed, that is indeed the government's policy. And we're working extremely hard to try to achieve that, including in discussions that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and indeed myself just yesterday I was having in the Middle East. He asked about RAF flights. The issue is not getting the aid to location. I've been working very closely with, for example, the Cypriot government on how we can increase the amount of aid. The single biggest problem remains getting the aid into the country. We had some success with getting Kerem Shalom open. What we really need to see is Ashdod open to route that aid to Kerem Shalom and straight into Gaza. And I will, and the government will, continue to push for that route. But the problem is not the flights taking off. The problem is the aid getting in itself. And then finally, I just want to turn his attention to the fact that it's myself standing here as Defence Secretary rather than the Prime Minister. The first thing to say is that it is actually the Secretary of State for Defence who has legal responsibility, who signs off the targets and indeed signs the legal authority for these. So technically it is indeed me who should be standing here, other than, of course, in the first couple of rounds where the Prime Minister was dealing with something which was new and therefore very appropriate. But the wider point that I just gently make to him is the Prime Minister is in Northern Ireland today, doing incredibly important work, which, I hear from a sedentary position the idea that we should have been recalled yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure that would have been entirely practical. So I think it's entirely appropriate the Prime Minister is in Northern Ireland. I would have thought the House would welcome the fact that that historic breakthrough has been marked by the Prime Minister, and I think it's very appropriate that I'm here today to explain the activity of Saturday night to the House.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the government accept that it is difficult to deter terrorist fanatics and that one mainly has to contain the effectiveness of what they do until ultimately they're destroyed, preferably by our regional allies? And does he feel that there is in fact a link to a separate conflict, and that is the conflict in Ukraine? Isn't it more than a coincidence that the proxies of Russia's ally in the Middle East have been so much more active, whilst Russia is so desperate that we turn our attention away from supporting Ukraine?
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend has absolutely hit the nail on the head. Russia and Iran working together, actually the same kind of drones being fired. Sometimes the Shahab drones being fired in Ukraine by the Russians, courtesy of Iran, are also being fired by the Houthis. He makes an excellent linkage point and he's absolutely right.
SNP spokesperson Dave Doogan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The people of Scotland and elsewhere on these islands deserve to know what the plan is with regard to this crisis in the Red Sea, not the timings or the detail of missions or the tactical ambition or resources behind these, but the broad strategy which is being pursued with lethal force in our name and in the absence of parliamentary approval. We have already made clear from the SNP benches that we support the government and international partners in direct action to uphold freedom of navigation and the law of the sea, but this should never have been taken for granted and remains subject to realistic interpretation of both self-defence and imminence. We see the toll that Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has taken on our constituents and businesses over energy costs, so we cannot allow this to be compounded further by interrupting global supply chains, and nor can we ever tolerate or stand idly by while seafarers are put at risk, whatever the supposed aims of the Houthis or their backers may be. This will be a sustained engagement. Will this, rather, Mr Speaker, will this be a sustained engagement? I don't know, and neither does the rest of Parliament. One way or another, it will be an allied seaborne strike capability that is engaged here. So, with one of the two aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy out of commission again, the Type 23 frigate fleet on its knees, the Type 45 destroyer fleet still going through PIP, who in the government has a grip of the Royal Navy's resources? And fundamentally, what is the UK government's plan to ensure that this campaign is not escalatory? What is their thinking behind any assessment that they've made? And in closing, Mr Speaker, this is not about supporting Gazans or people dying or fleeing the persecution in Gaza. This is about the Houthis pursuing their own aims. But I'd be interested to know what the government's assessment is of the uptick in temperature in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Yemen, and with NATO allied personnel being killed.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think actually, listening carefully to the Honourable Gentleman, I detected that he supports action that's been taken. As he said, it cannot be right that international shipping is prevented from its own freedom of navigation. And again, respecting the will of the House and listening very carefully, it's quite clear that the official opposition supports this action, as does the government, as I now learn does his own benches, and I remember the Liberal Democrats saying it previously. So I think it's quite clear there is strong support in this House, and I think it is also important that there is sufficient freedom of action to ensure the safety and security of our airmen and women when they do undertake these actions, rather than flagging them substantially in advance. He makes mention to, and so did the Right Honourable Gentleman, to the aircraft carrier. And I should just address this point. It is the case that actually through an abundance of caution on a final inspection, it was taken a decision for the aircraft carrier not to sail. I've also spoken to the First Sea Lord, who's also made it clear to me that if it were in an emergency sort of situation, the House will recall it was going to join exercise Steadfast Defender, then it quite probably would have sailed. The fact is we have another one, and that will sail to the Steadfast Defender. On the frigates and the destroyers, I just disagree with the Honourable Gentleman. I've been out to visit those on HMS Diamond in the Red Sea. They are absolutely prepared and ready to go. And as he says, that's one. But today, that ship has been replaced by HMS Richmond, who now take on that mantle. And Mr Speaker, we have 16 ships under construction or on order. I wonder how many you'd get from the SNP with their approach to defence.
Shelbrooke.
Mr Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for the in-depth statement he's given, and I just want to draw on, I think there is a concern about the stretch of the Royal Navy, and I think that it is a world-class leading Navy, but it is suffering from personnel issues to crew the ships. And I think the responsibility for this does lie back at the Treasury in being able to provide the revenue streams that are needed to make sure the capital equipment we've got can be used most effectively. So can I ask my right honourable friend what representations he's making to ensure that the growth in maritime concerns that are happening around the world will be met by commitment from Treasury?
State.
Well, I should make the point actually on a wider armed forces note. MOD note that we have £288.6 billion over the next 10 years for equipment. Now, my honourable friend's absolutely right that that's got to be matched by making sure that we have the sailors, the airmen and women and the army able to resource those. I have some good news for him, actually, which is we have seen, since we've been talking very actively about these issues, an 8-year high in applications to the Royal Navy, a 6-year high in applications to the Army, and a 42% increase this January to last January in applications to join the Royal Air Force. So I predict we are making progress.
Moran.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Secretary of State has seen the front page of the FT today, because it outlines how Iran has been using Lloyd's and Santander accounts to evade sanctions. The US is accusing front companies of funneling hundreds of millions of dollars for the IRGC and working with Russian intelligence to raise money for Iranian proxies. Now, I'm sure all in this House would be appalled to know that money being laundered here in our capital is being used against our own troops, by the Houthis. So what assessment has the government made of these allegations by our ally? And does this not show yet again how we must prescribe the IRGC now?
Well, this is an issue which I know is repeatedly raised in the House, and she will know because she will have heard the responses many times before. But we don't routinely comment on prescription. It is the case, though, that we do sanction, and we've sanctioned the entirety of the IRGC already, as well as a number of different actions. She'll appreciate it doesn't come directly within the defence portfolio, but I know that she'll have the opportunity to press foreign ministers and also the home ministers at a future time, but we do keep it under constant review.
Well, Pritchard. Speaker, I agree with the Secretary of State and indeed with the government that we don't want to see an escalation in the region and be proportionate in our response and calibrate our response and not to provoke and antagonise. But is it not the case that we might actually be hitting the wrong target? That we are hitting proxies of Iran? And whilst, I believe in peace and diplomacy, it is the malevolent factor in the region in all of this is Iran. And it might be the case that while we have the best of diplomatic intentions, we don't want to provoke Iran to a major conflict with NATO or the US or the UK, that actually putting off that decision now may well cost more lives in the future. Because Iran and the regime, not the Iranian people, but the regime in Iran are behind all of this. They're the ones destabilising Israel, the Abraham Accords and so on. So I hope the Secretary of State will take a strategic view and make hard choices on Iran, because whether we like it or not, they're coming.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is that Iran are behind all of this. When you think Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the IRGC-aligned militia that we've seen attack not just American. I quite often hear it's American personnel who are being attacked 160 separate times in Syria, in Iraq. In fact, about a third of those occasions involved British troops being attacked as well. And on every occasion, Iran behind all of this. So yes, I absolutely agree with him. We're working very hard to pressurise Iran into realising that their current approach can do no good at all, and it will destabilise the region, which they themselves claim they don't want to do.
John MacDonald.
Let me just say, a direct attack on Iran would be insanity. And we would provoke, the region would be provoked and others would be dragged into it. Let me just make that point first. But can I say, I understand why the government is saying, and I quote the Minister, wise not to overlink Houthi strikes with Gaza. I can understand that. But the reality is that the Middle East region is on the edge of conflagration as a result of the war that's going on, the attacks on Gaza itself. And therefore the priority must be to secure peace in Gaza. We have a limited role on that. But we know that Netanyahu would secure peace if pressurised by the American government, because they're the only power, realistically, that can influence him and influence the Israeli strategy. So can I ask now, what further talks have been taking place now with the Biden government to ensure that they exercise the maximum pressure on Netanyahu to get to that peace negotiating table.
Secretary of State.
Well, Speaker, the right honourable gentleman will be aware, I hope, that we work very closely on this. I was in the States last week. I met with Blinken, with Lloyd Austin and others in order to discuss exactly the point that he raises about how we bring together a solution which not only provides ultimately the Palestinian state for the Palestinian people, but also security guarantees for Israel. I think it's also important to realise that we are working very closely in a number of different spheres, including on the Lebanese border, where we are working hard to try to prevent a further conflict there. You remember that 125,000 Israelis have had to move from that border because of the activity of Lebanese Hezbollah. We're working with the Lebanese government. I spoke to the Yemeni defence minister. I saw him yesterday, and we discussed how to prevent that conflict from becoming part of it as well. So the government is pulling every single possible diplomatic lever in what is clearly a very complex position.
Selwood.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Secretary is right. This mission must continue to stand up and defend international laws in the Red Sea. But this mission to remove the Houthi threat and keep the Red Sea safe could last months, and it's not sustainable to continue tasking typhoons from Cyprus for each mission or indeed subsequent future threats. Would the Defence Secretary therefore agree there is a case for an urgent operational requirement to upgrade the Type 45 destroyers given its vertical launch system's continued inability to strike targets at range inland?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend takes a huge amount of interest in this. He'll be interested to hear on Friday I was on HMS Somerset in Devonport, where they're indeed fitting a surface-to-surface system, which may or may not be appropriate in this particular type of conflict. But I just actually want to take issue with one thing. We're in a coalition here, working with the US and others. There is no, as we've demonstrated repeatedly, there's no issue with typhoons flying a long distance. And indeed, when America carried out their unrelated attacks for the Tower 22, they flew all the way from the United States. So flying a long distance is no sign that the capability is not there in itself.
Ben Broderick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please have another go at giving a better answer to the question from the member for Oxford West and Abingdon about the extremely serious report in today's Financial Times that two of Britain's main banks are indirectly helping fund the Houthis, with whom we are now in some sort of conflict?
Well, he will have heard my answer a moment ago, and I know he wants me to go into fuller detail. I'm not able to do that at the dispatch box right now. We have noted both the question and that article of this morning, but we're also very intensely engaged in which is the best way to ensure that Iranian influence, whether it is through the UK or in the region, is limited, and I don't think I can go further at this moment.
Theresa Willis.
The Houthi rebels are violent, extremist, anti-Semites, and it's right that we take action to combat their aggression in the Red Sea. It seems their success in degrading their capabilities. Is the Secretary of State confident we'll get to the point where we can stop these attacks altogether?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the clock is running down for the Houthis, and as much as their ability is being degraded, as was pointed out, they don't have the eyes and ears from the radar stations, etc. They are more reliant still on Iran, and only the UK and the US have done interdictions of their weapons. So there is there's a limitation to this. Nonetheless, we still think that would, if they choose to, that would continue even at that lower level. But it's very important that they do cease and stop this, and we're putting pressure on, as I've described, for every possible means, including very extensive talks I had yesterday in Saudi Arabia with various different people, including not just the Saudis, but the Yemenis themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm what the long-term strategy is and how this relates to the ongoing precarious situation in Yemen itself? And is it the government's plan to commit to sustained military action? And if so, surely it's only right for Parliament to have its say in the appropriate way.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is the third time that we've come and made a statement, and I know the Honourable Lady has made other contributions to the debate. So we do feel that Parliament is being fully engaged in this process. We're not looking to make this as a sustained long-term military action. Indeed, I can guarantee the House that if the Houthis stop, we will have absolutely no requirement again to drop munitions on the Houthis. But it is a fact that they are the ones who are interrupting international maritime, and we cannot stand by and allow that to happen.
James Sunderland. Mr. Speaker, I know the Defence Secretary cannot comment specifically on target acquisition, but could he please confirm to the House that our ISTAR is focused on those Houthi capabilities that are directly engaged in the attacks upon international shipping? And is it reasonable to assume that further degradation of those capabilities will result in increased security in the Red Sea?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend asked a very good question, which I think hasn't been asked before, and the answer is yes, we're looking very carefully, and the locations chosen on this occasion were indeed a combination of US and UK intelligence.
Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, the government is right to have the strong response that it does have in what may seem to many people a faraway war or a faraway incident, but which can impact so much on people's lives here in the United Kingdom, either through shortages of food, supply chains being disrupted, and the inflationary impact. But given the reports which there have been about shortage of personnel in the Royal Navy, the reported difficulty in munitions, the difficulties with some ships, and now the increased demands on the Navy because of tensions with China, Russia, and maybe even in the future Argentina, can the Minister give us an assurance that we do have the capability of playing our part in keeping this supply chain open? And what discussions he had with other allies to get them involved in the task of supporting us in this job?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right about the importance of trade. 90% of our goods come to this country via the sea. So it really matters to the United Kingdom, but indeed it matters to the whole world. He mentions, I don't know, one or two others have, personnel, munitions, etc. I have not, in my time as Defence Secretary, been unable to deploy exactly where I've needed to at the request, for example, of NATO. When we deployed to Kosovo, they've returned home now. This conflict in the Middle East, where we've needed to carry out the actions that we're discussing. So on each occasion, those have been available. And I mentioned before a £288 billion 10-year programme on equipment, and also the success in more personnel being recruited. He's right, I do encourage other countries to match our comfortably above 2% and headed up to 2.5% of GDP defence budget, and the sooner they do that, the better.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully support the government's action in the Red Sea. The irony of the Iranian regime accusing the action that we took as destabilising regime when we lost the most reasonable people. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that those demonstrators on the streets of London applauding what the Houthi rebels have been doing are at best useful idiots and at worst truly the enemy within?
Well, look, I'll use my own language on it. It is disgraceful to see people go out and support those who are indiscriminately firing at merchant ships. I mean, that is absolutely appalling. I won't repeat his language. I'll put it down to ignorance rather than anything else.
Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is rightly clear about breaches of international law by the Houthis in the Red Sea. Can he be equally clear about breaches of international law by all sides in Gaza? And does he think that it will help reduce hostilities across the Middle East if the government were able to build a broader international coalition in support of its diplomatic and military aims?
Secretary of State.
Well, the United Kingdom government always supports and wants to see international humanitarian law adhered to, and it's a point that we make repeatedly to every point and every side in this conflict. I think he's driving at Israel, and Israel included, to answer his question directly. Hamas, of course, could end could end this very quickly by releasing the hostages that they still have kidnapped and cease firing on Israel. And in terms of wider coalitions, I did describe how we've now got New Zealand on board with actually the military action, but I should mention there are 20-plus countries also involved in the operation Prosperity Guardian, and the EU forming an addition to that as well, which we welcome.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to my honourable friend's question, as well as open support for the Houthis this weekend on the streets of central London, some of those pro-Palestinian marchers also again called for an intifada, held deeply racist anti-Semitic signs, one of which included informing Israelis, by that we presume Jewish Israelis, that they were indigenous to nowhere other than hell. So I'm not sure that this is just ignorance. I think there is something more sinister at play with some of these protesters, and we should call it what it is. It's pure and simple Jew hate. So can the Secretary of State inform the House whether he has spoken to anybody else across government about more action to deal with some of this hate on our streets?
Well, I do know that the Home Secretary continuously keeps this under review and also meets with the police chiefs to make sure that they have the powers to combat what he rightly describes as absolutely disgusting behaviour, which has no place at all on our streets. The whole House, I'm sure, needs no reminding, but perhaps they do, the people who go out and campaign. Their slogan for the Houthis is death to America, death to Israel, death to the Jews, no matter where they are. There is no place for that on the streets of Britain.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an extraordinary situation where the Secretary of State comes here, makes a matter-of-fact statement about the launching of missiles against a number of targets in a number of countries, gives no indication of what the long-term war aim is by the UK at the present time, says absolutely nothing about the crying, desperate need for a ceasefire to protect the people of Gaza from further death and further destruction. Does he not realise that the extension of the conflict by Britain and the United States to at least 4 other countries risks a huge conflagration across the whole region? I would have been much happier if he had come here and said Britain was determined to try to deal with the injustices in the region and try to bring about a peace process rather than further militarisation of all the seaways around all of those countries. Surely peace is something to aim for rather than a continuation of yet more wars.
Well, Mr. Speaker, never have I disagreed so much with the honourable gentleman, and that is saying something from the man who wants to scrap Trident, from the man who wants to pull us out of NATO. The debate, the statement is on the Red Sea, and I'm surprised that he's not more appreciative of the geography of this. The Red Sea is a very long way in the case of where these attacks are taking place from Gaza. He, therefore, I'm afraid, misunderstands why I've come to this House to talk about actually munitions on a single country, not 3 countries, as he says. I spoke to the Yemeni government yesterday, who thank us for our work. It's a shame he can't do the same.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I commend the Defence Secretary for his excellent work. And he talks about Yemen. Yemen's Foreign Minister, Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, said on Thursday that there is no doubt that Iran's Quds Force operatives have been deployed to his own coastline in Yemen. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of the extent of Iran's aggressive military adventurism and its destabilising effect on international peace and security?
Well, they are quite simply, Iran, a malign influence on Yemen, and not just on Yemen, but the entire region. And so my right honourable friend's absolutely right to point out the manner in which they have really helped to create instability in the Red Sea. And I'm afraid the only language that they understand is the approach that we have been taking to show them that there is a red line and they've crossed it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I completely understand and agree with the need to protect international shipping, maritime security and ensure the safety of civilians and seafarers in the Red Sea. However, some of us are also very concerned about a wider escalation in this already volatile region. So can the Defence Secretary outline what steps is the government taking, diplomatic or otherwise, to prevent us being sucked into an escalating regional conflict?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as described, the actions that we're discussing here today are very specific and very targeted, and I know that he recognises that. They're not open to being repeated unless attacks on us continue, so they can actually stop immediately. And in terms of the wider diplomacy, which I've gone into some detail on, I met with Sullivan, with Blinken, with Lloyd Austin in the States. The Foreign Secretary has been doing the same with his opposite numbers. I would just describe that I was in the region until this morning, where I was having extensive discussions about how to bring this to a conclusion. For it's not always possible to provide a line-by-line explanation of every single element of those talks, which I appreciate is frustrating to the House, but the efforts are broad and very strenuous to achieve exactly what he's looking for.
Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Secretary has said the government's looking at a comprehensive strategy, four-pronged approach to degrade the Houthis. The question that I have for the Defence Secretary is this. We've classified the actions of the Houthis as terrorist. We've said that they pose a significant threat to British interests. I then look at the prescribed terrorist organisations document from the House of Commons library. It lists non-state actors, Ansar al-Islam, Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, Hezbollah. All of them meet the criteria for prescription. Yet the Houthis are not prescribed as a terrorist organisation. The Secretary of State says we've sanctioned some high-level individuals. US has prescribed them, we haven't. And the question I asked to the Defence Secretary linked to that is this. Will the UK set up a contact group to deal with non-state actors in the long term? Because this threat is not going to go away. The Houthis will then splinter to other terrorist organisations in the region.
Yes. So stay.
He rightly points out that the US have taken some action. It's not quite the same as our prescription. It's a sort of in-between version, in this particular case, with the Houthis. We have also, of course, made sure that a number of different individuals, I named them in my comments, have effectively been dealt with. So then the wider question is getting the balance right between making sure that food aid can still reach Yemen. That was a discussion that I was having with the Yemeni government yesterday, and full prescription. I mean, we need to make sure we get that balance right. And my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is working very closely on that. Whether you call that a contact group or something else, I can assure my honourable friend the work is being done.
Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like others, I commend the government's diplomatic efforts to resolve the broader conflict, and this one, in fact. But if diplomatic means fail to resolve this particular conflict in the Red Sea, is he determined to pursue the military option to the very end?
So stay.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've described in the answer to others, we see this action as being very, very specific, and it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to continue. What I don't see as being short-term and specific is the diplomatic process, which he refers to, which absolutely needs to now do what the world hasn't been able to do for decades, which is to form a wider peace in the Middle East. And you can see the pieces potentially are there with normalisation between countries like Saudi Arabia, potentially, and Israel. Hamas's intent, Iran's intent, is to disrupt all of that. We understand that, and that's why we have to work all the harder to make sure we can overcome their approach to creating instability in the region.
Dr. Matthew Alford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We cannot overestimate the value of freedom of navigation in the region, and that's why it's not surprising that New Zealand has joined the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, Bahrain, Denmark and the Netherlands in providing support over the weekend. But what concerns me is Egypt. Egypt continues to face both economic and social disadvantage, and the Suez Canal provides £9.4 billion of trade to the economy in Egypt. The last thing we want is for that to be disrupted. So can the Secretary of State advise what he will do to help counter the destabilising activity of the Houthi pirates in the region?
So stay.
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and this, of course, is devastating for the Egyptian economy. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I met with my opposite number, the Defence Minister, the Egyptian Defence Minister, and we discussed exactly this point. It is clear that ships are avoiding and then taking a much longer route round at the moment, and so it's in everybody's interest, of course, the Suez Canal in particular, to see this resolved as quickly as possible.
Debbie Abraham.
Mr. Speaker. It was reported last night that only the UK and US were involved actively in the military action over the weekend. And this was attributed to the different risk assessments that the UK and the US had compared to other international partners. So is that the case? Because this was, as I say, these were the reports. And if that is the case, can he discuss what the particular concerns were about the different risk assessments about inflation of the conflict in the area?
Mr. Speaker, it's difficult for me to answer for why different countries would take part or not. There's a much wider group of countries who take part in Operation Prosperity Guardian, so the freedom of navigation part of it. A number of the other countries have actually actively provided assistance, including intelligence officers and the like. I think the truth of the matter is that actually there are only relatively few countries in the world who actually have the capability, the capacity to carry out this action, and I think it should be a matter of pride, in fact, that when push comes to shove, it is the United Kingdom who is able to step up and carry out some of this difficult work.
Wild. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given continuing attacks by Iranian-backed Houthis, will the government, as well as pursuing diplomacy and trying to stop the illegal flow of weapons and finance, be prepared to intensify military action in self-defence with our allies to degrade the ability for further attacks on commercial shipping?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I should be absolutely clear. We will only act within international law. That is a law which is about self-defence. So we respond to those attacks in turn. We will never. We are not looking to increase the implications of this, as I've described very carefully, because we want to bring it to a close. But this remains open-ended, and we'll have to go back if they do not stop.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not simply the Houthis who say that this issue is inextricably linked to Gaza, but the Embassy of Yemen has made it clear in paragraph 4 of its letters to all MPs. Equally, Brigadier Deverell, the former British military attaché in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, has also said that it is linked. He has also gone on to add that this striking will actually fail and will not resolve the situation. So rather than lurching towards World War III, rather than an escalation of the conflict, widening it beyond countries and their limited territory, is it not time to ensure that Israel's call to heal, that their genocide ceases and that we get an immediate ceasefire?
So I think the honourable gentleman will detect the House hasn't followed the logic of his argument. There is a difference between this being absolutely inextricably not linked to Gaza, apart from when members opposite might try to do so, and the Houthis claiming that it's somehow linked as a badge of convenience, as a way of trying to muscle in on that action. And I'm very, very sorry that the honourable gentleman chooses to repeat their propaganda.
Reg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to the IRGC deployment on the coastline of Yemen that my right honourable friend for Northampton North referenced, Tehran has also deployed its Alborz warship to the Red Sea, and we know that 2 US Navy SEALs have died after attempting to seize Iranian weapons bound for the Houthis. Yet Iran continues to evade any meaningful deterrence. So will my right honourable friend agree with me that Iran must not be allowed to outsource the responsibility for its regional escalation to its proxies and must be deterred directly?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point about the link between the Iranian, for example, ships that loiter in the region, the items which are shipped to the Houthis, which we know come from Iran because of the interdictions that we've made previously. It's probably wise if I don't go into too much detail, but to say that we are aware of it is absolutely correct, and the whole world needs to carry on piling the pressure on Iran to cease and desist this behaviour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Secretary was right to highlight the risk to humanitarian aid in the region, and not least with the catastrophic situation in Gaza. Could he set out for the House what steps he has deployed through air capability as well as sea capability over the last 4 months in order to establish routes of aid by sea or by air into Gaza?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I would actually link the action that we've been taking to degrade the Houthis' ability to prevent that aid from reaching them. Because, as I said in my opening comments, they get almost all of their food via the Red Sea. So I would class all of the action we've taken now in 3 rounds of strikes to be very much part of getting that food into the country. As I mentioned in my comments, we provide significant amounts of aid. We feed about 100,000 Yemenis a month off the back of it, and it is the Houthis who are trying to prevent that from happening.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We support the right for shipping to pass freely. It seems from talking to businesses that actually they're already feeling the effects of this in their supply chains. But if one of the purposes of the strikes is to act as a deterrent to the Houthis, it seems that they haven't got the message yet, and it's not clear if they actually ever will. So I am concerned that there is a risk we are going to escalate in the region. And I know the Secretary of State's already set out a number of activities he's undertaken on a non-military basis to try and reduce tensions. But is there anything else that he's able to do that he hasn't done already that will help end this conflict?
I think, although it's true to say that clearly the Houthi attacks haven't ended, as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Defence Secretary said, there does appear to have been a difference in the cadence of this, perhaps, and the mass attacks we saw, for example, on the 11th of January haven't been repeated. That will be in part because the ability has been degraded. But we're always looking at other means, including routes via the UN and the wider picture of things like the peace treaty between Saudi and Yemen. All of these things are fitting into the way that we are applying pressure to try to bring the situation to a close.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his statement, a very strong, robust determination to stop the attacks on international shipping. Well done, Secretary of State, and we in this House, certainly most of us, support the line of action that you're taking. Does the Secretary of State not agree that the fact that pro-Hamas Houthi sites are celebrating the effect that the strikes in the Red Sea are having on food chains and supply chains is a signal of the fact that the words spoken and actions taken by this country, our government and our allies is not yet having the desired effect? And what steps will the Secretary of State and her allies and our allies determined to take to not simply secure trade route difficulties from escalating already eye-watering prices, but to send a clear message that the United Kingdom are not afraid to use our strength, not afraid to use our intelligence to respond adequately, and indeed, if so, even more strongly?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a very worthwhile point. It is clear that the Houthis are perhaps no longer able to act as they once were, but they're not fully degraded. There must surely come a time where they understand that this is no longer in their interests, because we are working actively to make sure that we intercept new supplies as far as possible, and they will continue to be degraded if they continue to act as they have done on commercial shipping and, of course, on the Royal Navy. So there is eventually a conclusion to that. What I don't want to do is mislead the House by saying this is over, because I just cannot guarantee that for one moment, and I'll be clear again from this dispatch box. We will always have to keep the option open if it isn't over.
Order. That concludes the statement on the Red Sea route. Can I thank the Secretary of State and the Opposition front bench? Could members leaving the chamber please do so quickly and quietly?